Okay, hi everyone. Back for lesson 5 here at Riot. Picking up where we left off, where I was making the point about bone being a living, growing tissue. So we're going to go a little further with that today. We've primarily talked about the mechanical function of bone, that being to bear weight and transmit force. But bone also has a synthetic function, meaning that it creates blood cells. It creates red and white blood cells. And it also has a metabolic function. So it stores things. It stores minerals and calcium. It generates hormones. It releases salts that support the pH balance of the body. And it detoxifies, it stores heavy metal in the bones. So it stores stuff, it generates stuff, and it has this mechanical function that we've already talked about bearing weight and transmitting force. So there's a lot going on in here, in this, well, not yet. There's a lot going on in these bones, and hopefully as we look at kind of what's happening inside, that will further support the case for bones being these super dynamic living things, living beings. I hope you've all colored your this plate in your anatomy coloring book on the long bone structure. I think it's a pretty good one, although you don't maybe need all that much detail. I'll go over what I think are the important details for our purposes. But do, if you haven't colored it yet, press pause and go grab it. So you've got that in front of you. And I put, it's hard to see on the video, but I also put this sort of schematic image up on Google Classroom. I don't know if you can still see me, but you can follow along with that, and I'm going to do my best to sort of color in this bone here. So this is sort of a typical long bone, I guess. I'm imagining it, not imagining it, I'm casting it as a femur, casting it, get it? So the first layer, or the outermost layer, of a bone is called the periosteum. Yeah, and you can think of the periosteum as being, and this is yellow, so you probably can't see it, but just know that it's the skin of the bone. Yeah, it's the suit, like the wetsuit of the bone that goes all the way around. Yeah, so qualities of the periosteum is that it contains those fibroblasts and fibroclasts that we were talking about that are help regulating when to create more bone and when to dissolve bone that we don't need. So it's serving that function, but it's also really rich in nerve endings. Right, so our bones actually have nerve endings in them that are sensing things and giving us information. And the nerve endings in the periosteum are particularly sensitive to changes in temperature and excess pressure. And I thought that was interesting because today is the first day in Seattle where it's cold and rainy, the first of many days, and I was just thinking of that turn of phrase, like, that kind of cold that gets into your bones. So it was kind of cool to plan this lesson today and think of this periosteum skin as actually being able to sense temperature. So that's the periosteum, and the only sort of variance in the periosteum is do they call it? Yeah, articular cartilage is in your coloring sheet. So there's the remnants of when our bones were cartilage still exists at the points of contact where the bone is going to be meeting another bone. So anytime you hear the word articular, it's meaning in reference to a joint. So two bones articulating with each other, coming into relationship, makes for a joint. And on either side of that joint, you're going to have articular cartilage, right? So it's slippery and glidey. And if this is your femur, we haven't looked at the femur yet, but I thought it was a simple long bone to understand. So this is the neck and the ball of the femur that would be going into your, if this is the femur right here, coming into my hip joint, and then down here articulating with the top of my tibia. Yeah, so again, sorry, you probably can't see this, and this pen doesn't work, but I'll just thicken up the I'll thicken up the part of the bone where there's going to be articular cartilage present. Yeah, articulating with the pelvic half on this side and with the tibia on this side. Yeah, okay? So wherever there's articular cartilage, we know there's going to be a joint and a nice slippy, slidey surface that helps that this side of the bone move in that joint. Okay? So that's the periosteum and the articular cartilage. The next layer in is compact bone. And compact bone you can think of as being like the shell of the bone. I'm thinking of like those kind of like that, like Easter egg chocolate, yeah, that has that shell and then there's stuff inside. I don't know if that's a useful image for you. Yeah, but the sort of dense shell of the bone. It doesn't extend all the way to the tips of the bone, which is sort of a fancy word you don't need to know, but it says epiphyseus, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, but meaning the ends of the bone, as opposed to the diaphysis, meaning the long part of the bone. Don't worry about knowing that. Just know that next in after the periosteum is this layer of shell-like compact bone. Yeah? What is interesting about that? So the compact bone organizes along lines of stress, right? So that's part of what, when we were talking about looking at bone and looking at where lines of stress and weight is moving through, the cells in the compact bone are organizing along those lines of stress, and they are particularly sensitive to pressure. Yeah, so this is the part of the bone that senses pressure. Okay, so next is what I like to call trabecular, just because I like that word. But in your anatomy coloring book, they call it, and I'm going to mispronounce this too, cancellous, C-A-N-C-E-L-L-O-U-S. I have it drawn here in pink. Or spongy bone is also nice. So trabecular or spongy bone, and it is going all throughout like this. Yeah, spongy, 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 spongy. Yeah. Yeah. So, and in between all of, in between the spaces in the sponge is bone marrow. And blood vessels. So yeah, inner meshwork of bone. I like that idea of sponginess or a meshwork inside the bone. Also organizes along lines of stress. And trabecula, meaning small beams. Okay, small beams. And the spaces between the little beams are filled with marrow. So you can imagine bits of bone marrow throughout this trabecular bone. Yeah. And then in the innermost cavity is called the medullar cavity. And if you imagine a cavity like this. Yeah, and the medullar cavity is filled with bone marrow. Yeah. So in your plate of in the anatomy book, it distinguishes between red and yellow marrow, and saying that the red marrow is the kind that makes blood, right? And that yellow is a fatty. What does it say? A fatty. Fatty connective tissue that doesn't make blood. But recent science shows that that yellow marrow can actually turn into red marrow and make blood if the need is there. which I think is pretty cool. Talk about being adaptable. In increased, can change back to red bone marrow in times of increased demand for blood. So I think that's pretty cool. Let's see. Oh, the other thing I thought was cool was this. Let me write these. This is the marrow going from the inside out. Trabecular. Compact. And the periosteum. Yeah, so those are the 4 layers that I think are most important, or that I think I'd like you to consider this week. What was I going to, the other word I liked, having to do with the marrow, is the marrow cells are considered to be, I'm going to butcher this too, I'm sure, hematopoietic. Hema meaning blood, the root for blood, and poetic meaning generative or creative. So I loved that word as creating of blood. Hematopoietic, I think is how it's said. So it being generative, that deepest layer of bone being generative, I think is super cool. Let's see. You are going to, in your class with Peggy and Nanette, play around with putting hands-on, thinking about these layers of bone, but I think it's not too soon to play around with it yourself, if you want, and think about the difference in, if you just put a hand on your own bone, right, any bone, in the difference in your experience when you change your intention from attention or intention to I'm touching the skin, the sheath of the bone, versus I'm touching the dense compact bone, the shell of my bone, versus the spongy stuff, deeper than that, versus the deep marrow, which, speaking of temperature, I imagine to be warm or hot, like lava, but I don't know if it really is, but I like that. For me, the experience of my marrow is one of heat. So play around with your own body, with your own selves, and see what comes up for you in your experience around playing with skin, shell, sponge, and marrow. Heat, or not necessarily heat, whatever marrow means to you. So I suggest that. The other little tidbit I wanted to add to this lesson is that when we're talking about the synthetic property of bone in its generating blood, I think it's an interesting fact to know that the tissues most demanding of oxygen in our body, the 2 tissues most demanding of oxygen are number 1, the brain, and number 2, the bone marrow. So I'm positing, that the quieter our brains, the more oxygen we have available for our bones. And there's this sort of nice cycle that happens in that the oxygen in our body is what nourishes this bone marrow so that it can produce red blood cells. And the red blood cells are what carry the oxygen through our bloodstream, through our body. So it's sort of this nice cyclical relationship of blood and bones, that the oxygen is coming in to nourish the production of red blood cells, which in turn spreads or travels the oxygen back out to the body. So there's this nice sort of cyclical relationship between, and very dynamic, moving, living relationship between bones and oxygen, between bones and breath. And I was thinking of back to that quote, I think it was from Mabel Todd, about the discipline of centering ourselves around the bones and the breath. And I thought this was sort of a cool representation of that dynamic relationship. So, the other thing, and Nanette says this often, is that in terms of energy consumed by the brain, the most energy is consumed by decision making. And that it doesn't matter if the decision is big or small. Just the act of having to make a decision is incredibly exhausting for the brain, as I'm sure we've all experienced, right? That feeling of, I just cannot make one more decision today, right? There's a physiological underpinning for that. And I was just thinking of that in relation to our Alexander practice, how I was curious about this way in which, on one hand, we're very much concerned with quieting down. And on the other hand, I feel like in my Alexander practice, especially at the beginning and when I was in training, I felt like there was a lot of decision-making energy that I was expending, which I think is part of why I would get so exhausted after a day of training. So you can think about what that experience is like for you, and that maybe that relationship between quieting your brain and also having to make conscious decisions, and that maybe the quality or the means whereby we make decisions affects the degree of quiet or the degree of oxygen available for our brain and thereby our bones. Those are just sort of questions I had that were coming up as I was looking at this material that I thought might be interesting for you to consider this week. Yeah. Okay, so I'll see you next time.